I'm joined today with Professor Mietek Boduszynski, former U.S. diplomat to the Middle East and Professor of Political Science at Pomona College. Welcome to OMU, and we're happy to have you here.
Thanks, Declan. Very happy to be here.
I'd like to start off by asking you about your time as a U.S. diplomat in the Middle East. Can you give a brief outline about just your role and what was entailed in the position?
Sure. So I actually didn't have much of a background in the Middle East before I took on these assignments as a Foreign Service officer. I hadn't studied Arabic in college or traveled much in the region, but the opportunity came up to serve in the region, and I took the assignment on in 2010 or so, not knowing that the Arab Spring was going to happen. And then I found myself in first Egypt and then Libya, and then eventually in Iraq after the Arab Spring. So it's one of the things about being a diplomat, you never know what's going to change in the country you serve in, and it turned out that these changes were very historic, and I was lucky to work in these countries, especially in Egypt and Libya, right after these momentous changes happened. In Libya, I was the public affairs officer, so I was responsible for media relations, for cultural and educational programming. And it was an exciting time to do that work in Libya because this dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, had just fallen, and there was a chance to build a new relationship with the United States. So it was great.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so as you've outlined in your book, U.S. democracy promotion today is virtually non-existent. Coming into the Trump presidency, you write that U.S. democracy promotion in the Arab world has been swallowed up by a new war on terror, an interventionist gulf, and disillusionment in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. We have seen Trump perpetuate Gulf involvement by affirming authoritarian regimes such as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. However, I would like to turn towards the current situation in Iran that's happened in the past month or so regarding Trump's foreign policy there. Was Trump's foreign policy with Iran worrisome for democracy promotion in the Middle East? Even though the controversial airstrike against Soleimani was done for security reasons of an imminent threat, what are the potential democratic consequences for that?
Great. So just a couple of correctives to your introduction there. I think that I wouldn't say that democracy promotion is non-existent. As I write in the book, there's democracy promotion on different levels, and I think at the level of the White House, there's not a lot of interest in democracy promotion. But I think at the level of the bureaucracy, the State Department, USAID, and other agencies, I think democracy promotion is still happening in some ways. The second thing is vis-a-vis the Gulf countries. So here we're talking about Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. I think the U.S. policy of looking the other way and maintaining strong partnerships with these countries, even though they're quite repressive internally, is not just a Trump policy. I think it was a policy of Obama. I think it was a policy of George W. Bush before him and before that, right? So unfortunately, we're locked into that paradigm. And some people would say that's in our interest, and people would say it's not. And that's the dilemma they address in the book. But to get to the Soleimani killing, so, when you talk about democracy promotion in countries like Iran or North Korea, where there's a nuclear non-proliferation issue, it's complicated by the fact that you would like to see democracy in those countries, and many people in those countries would like a more open government, but you have this greater goal of dealing with the nuclear issue. And so I think in those kinds of situations, compromises necessarily have to be made. And some would criticize, the Obama administration for striking the nuclear deal with Iran while not addressing the issue of political repression. But maybe the Obama people would say, yes, that's true, but this was the greater threat. And then, then we can talk about in the future about perhaps some way that the U.S. Could help Iran become a democracy. Was killing Soleimani in any way related to this larger issue of political repression in Iran, and can Iran move on from that? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, Soleimani is part of the apparatus of repression in Iran. The Revolutionary Guard Corps are definitely part of what people know as the hardliners, who keep the lid on any kind of dissent. And yet, killing a high-level official of a foreign state is extremely risky, legally problematic, and everything else. Are some people in Iran happy that he's dead? Probably. They're not going to say it loudly. Are lots of people in the Middle East happy that he's dead? Yes, absolutely. And does that help democracy? I don't know if I can make a direct link. I mean, to the extent that Soleimani and his forces were violating the sovereignty of countries like Iraq and Lebanon, then maybe you could make the argument that it does. But again, everything in international relations is about balancing, right? Risks and opportunities. And I think, again, killing a high-level official in the way that the U.S. did it is extremely risky.
So as you said, it's a balance. It can be risky. United States has taken more of a risky approach today. During the Cold War, realism played a very important role in America's active democracy promotion. In Eastern European countries and Germany, the U.S. Marshall Plan gave $13 billion of aid towards democracy building in order to prevent the spread of communism. Is it naive to believe that the United States will actively pursue democracy promotion when there's not a security interest being fulfilled?
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the U.S. record, it's mixed or spotty at best, right? And often, democracy promotion happened where there was some other interest that aligned with democracy promotion, or conversely, if there was an interest that challenged the promotion of democracy, then the U.S. often looked the other way. And there was countless examples of regimes throughout Latin America and Africa and Asia where the U.S. Maintained close relations with very autocratic governments because they were on the U.S. side in the Cold War. Having said that, I think in the 1980s there was a turn, and maybe this confirms your argument or the premise of your question, that it coincided with the Soviet Union in decline and with détente and so on. I think there were cases where the U.S. did change its policy in a meaningful way, whether that's South Africa or whether that's Chile or whether that's Philippines or South Korea, where I think the Reagan administration did realize belatedly that standing by these corrupt strongman rulers or the apartheid system in South Africa wasn't in the U.S. interest, despite the Cold War calculations. And from then on, we see this movement towards more genuine democracy promotion. So it's complicated. And then, of course, we have U.S. humanitarian interventions in places like Kosovo or Libya, which didn't necessarily align with U.S. interests. So I don't think you can always explain it that way, but probably in many cases you can.
Okay. And then in terms of the U.S. interests and how democracy promotion may not align with it, how could we evolve U.S. interests to be in line with democracy promotion? How can we make the United States want that to be a top priority?
Well, I think we have to have an honest discussion about our relationship with particular countries and reframe our interests and think about, have a discussion that involves the public and Congress and a broader range of people about what our interests really are. And the Gulf countries, which you started out our conversation with, are sort of a case in point, because those are countries where for a long time, because of interests like oil and protecting Israel, we thought that it was better to basically prop up these monarchies, that are sort of medieval like monarchies that are politically repressive, often very corrupt, often don't enjoy broad legitimacy, and we did that because we had these other interests. Well, that's changed. We're not dependent on Middle East oil anymore, and that should lead us to rethink what our interests are. Even the Israel thing is not that important anymore because countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have found common cause with Israel, which is with Israel, which is to counter Iran, and they're cooperating with Israel quite well despite the United States. And so I think all of this should lead us to rethink. What kind of friends do we want to have? And our friends like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who kill dissident journalists. Recently, I just yesterday read a BuzzFeed report about there was apparently a plan that just came to light in the media to kidnap a student here in Southern California, a Saudi student, dissident student who was at the University of San Diego. So again, are these the kind of friends we want to have? Does that mean we cut off all relations with Saudi Arabia? No. But does it mean that that we have this sort of unconditional support, that we don't criticize them at all, that we hold them up as a close ally, that we? I mean, that's something I think we have to rethink.
Awesome, interesting. Okay, so past U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East like muddied the lines between democracy promotion and security. The war in Iraq showed this with going into Iraq and liberating as like a form of like democracy promotion, but in reality there was also an aspect of security, like counterterrorism after the 9/11 incident. Understanding that counterterrorism and democracy promotion have been intertwined despite all of this, what is the best way the United States can proceed and balance both causes in the future? And you've already touched up on this, but...
The counterterrorism and democracy promotion are tough ones. And I think that on one hand, after 9/11, there was this recognition that maybe political repression and extremism are somehow linked. And so therefore promoting democracy would actually be a form of counterterrorism, because maybe by making governments more accountable, more responsive, less repressive, it would take some of the raison d'etre away from some of the jihadist groups that were out there, including Al-Qaeda, right, the one that attacked us on 9/11. The problem is that this all became very muddled, because I think the Bush administration fell into this trap where, yes, they talk about promoting democracy as a form of countering extremism, but they also realized that to carry out their favorite tools of counterterrorism, which were things like drone warfare and kill and capture operations, they had to maintain relations with intelligence agencies in very repressive countries, right? So that dilemma was never really fully resolved. And Iraq, you're absolutely right. That was like the epitome of muddling different issues. And Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, and I don't believe in democracy promotion by force. But let's just say that it happened. Toppling Saddam Hussein was something that maybe Iraqis could rally around. Unfortunately, for a number of other reasons, including the muddled justification for the invasion, as well as the botched occupation and reconstruction. Unfortunately, we lost the Iraqis, and then also lost in some sense, the brand of democracy promotion, which then Obama was reacting to when he came into power.
So as you said earlier, there is like still democracy promotion like with the United States, just not on all levels. And so we've seen drifts in response to the Arab Spring within the Obama administration. In your book, you talked about during the Egyptian uprising, Frank Wisner, who's Obama's special envoy to Cairo, he gave a speech in support of President Mubarak in Egypt, and that differed from Obama's full-on public showing of the event. So how do you feel about or how would you say how am I asking this? Do you think that it's good or bad for how there's division within administrations?
Well, so Frank Wisner, interestingly, was a retired U.S. diplomat, former ambassador to Egypt, who had a good relationship with President Mubarak, who the Obama administration wanted to nudge out of power. So they thought that he would be the good guy to do that. Unfortunately, like many senior diplomats who had worked in the Arab world, U.S. diplomats, they were very much, I'm sorry to use the I can't think of a better word, but in bed with these, with these very autocratic regimes. And I think he couldn't think beyond that. And so he, took Wisner kind of out of retirement and sent him as a special envoy. He wasn't then in government, right? So he's a little bit Giuliani-esque in that respect. And that's the danger of having, people outside of government delivering important messages. But, I don't want, that analogy only goes so far because he was a former diplomat, well versed in the ways of the world. But in any case, he probably delivered a softer message to Mubarak than Obama wanted. And then on top of that, a couple of days later at a security conference in Munich, said that Mubarak should remain president until there's an orderly transition, which was exactly the opposite message of what Obama wanted to deliver. So the problem of mixed messages emanating from the U.S. government is not going to be completely solved because we're a democracy, and we have different parts to our foreign policy. But I think that when we talk about democracy promotion, mixed messages are even more harmful at these sensitive moments during a transition because foreign governments, and particularly autocrats, will use that to their advantage. And the most kind of visible example of that is how autocratic governments with whom we maintain a military relationship will play the Department of Defense, or the Pentagon, as it's popularly known, against other parts of our government, right? And that's, and they often know how to do that because they've been around for a long time. Our people rotate through, the president, of course, rotates. And so they can do that very effectively to achieve their aims.
Would you say it's beneficial then, because democracy to have the different views? say everyone was 100% allegiant to President Trump and his foreign policy, or you could say with like Obama or past presidents, would that be a dangerous thing?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I know what you're getting at, because now, depending on what political, side you're on of the aisle, so to say, now people are rallying, especially if you're anti-Trump, then you're rallying behind the bureaucracy, and Trump is calling them the deep state, right? Whereas in my book, when I'm writing about the Obama administration, I'm saying, well, making the argument that this deep state, the bureaucracy, actually thwarted, President Obama's goals. So what is the right line there? I mean, obviously we need a bureaucracy, we need civil servants, we need continuity, because a president can't possibly, cognitively absorb every foreign policy issue in the world. So we need some parts of the State Department that are dealing with countries like, I don't know, the Gambia or Costa Rica, that the president may never hear throughout his term, that the policy is continuing. But I think when it comes to these big moments, these big moments where there's a transition, where, an autocratic government fails, then it's important for the government really to be on the same page, and including, the Department of Defense, even where it has these relationships. And I think that's where, sometimes our government has failed to deliver a consistent message. Again, leaving the issue of where the U.S. stands ambiguous, which I think hurt our policy in the end. But you're right; it's a difficult balancing game, because the executive, the president is elected by the people and is the chief executive, and the State Department diplomat, whether they like the president or not, is an unelected official, right? And they can't go and be making their own policy, because that's not the way democracy works.
Awesome. Okay. So I have one last question, and lastly, in your book, you mentioned that bureaucratic institutions are slow and hard to change. You kind of brought that up here, where like they are unelected. They have positions that will be filled, and it's like Trump calls it the deep state, I guess. But how do you think voters can impact this inability to change in the aspect of democracy promotion? Like, can us voters have an impact on how the United States plays its foreign policy? Yeah,
I mean, so mostly, public opinion and just the public in general doesn't have much influence over foreign policy. It's traditionally been an elite exercise. But here's one way where I think the public, at least indirectly, can have an impact, and I would say that's Congress, right? So the Constitution sets out a role for Congress in overseeing foreign policy, even though it gives the president a lot of power. And until now, especially after 9/11, Congress has sort of yielded its authority to the president, mostly because of this terrorism thing, right? This paranoia about terrorism. God forbid if we, check the president's powers in any way, and then there's an attack, and then we don't get reelected, right? And I think it has to go both ways. It's chicken and egg thing. Both congressional leaders need to be more honest with their constituents about our foreign policy. About issues like drone warfare, about the legality of that and whether it's actually effective. And I think in some ways we've seen Congress step up to the plate on issues like Saudi Arabia to some extent, on Yemen. More recently there was an effort to check the president's war powers on Iran. And there's individual members of Congress, one of them, Ro Khanna, who's from California, who are really, I think, pushing back on some of these issues. And yet there's still this reluctance to own an issue, because to the extent that we are engaged with our Congress people and the Congress people are engaged with us, I think that's one area. But beyond that, of course, just being educated about foreign policy. Most Americans don't care much about it, as we know, during elections. It always comes down to just sound bites. Yeah. And foreign policy is more complicated than that.
So would you say activism then is maybe the best option?
I think activism is one route, but I think that the media sphere, especially social media sphere, has opened up all kinds of opportunities for beyond the Twitter kind of sphere, but and there's so many different venues now to write op-eds or commentaries and to be engaged. Most cities, even if you're not in Washington D.C., have organizations like here in LA. There's the World Affairs Council, Pacific Council, where people are engaged on policy issues. So I think, there are ways to at least be part of the conversation, but probably the most effective way would be to, push Congress to step up to its constitutionally given role as a check of the president's power on foreign policy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.